The Pacific horizon glimmers with steel blue waters as a massive LNG carrier, loaded with Canadian natural gas, slices its way towards South Korea. On the other side of the border, Washington erupts in frustration, tweets, tariffs, and threats flooding the media as the White House scrambles to respond. Just a few years ago, such a shipment would have been unthinkable without US involvement. But now, Canada has found a direct line to Asia, bypassing the old gatekeepers. This is not just another trade story. It's a geopolitical uppercut. When Canadian energy, led by Mark Carney's audacious strategy, begins to rewrite the map of global supply, it's not just profits at stake, it's power. Trump's America First narrative suddenly collides with a neighbor that's no longer playing the supporting role. The question is chilling and clear. Can the US still call the shots when Canada holds the trump card? For decades, the energy relationship between the United States and Canada was one of quiet dominance, on Washington's terms. Since the mid-20th century, Canada served as America's most reliable source of oil and gas, with over 95% of its energy exports flowing south. Pipelines like Keystone and Enbridge created a tightly knit dependency where Canadian crude filled American refineries, especially in the Midwest, and American markets gave Canada guaranteed revenue. The arrangement was stable, predictable, and mutually profitable, so long as Canada played by the old rules. But the stability began to crack in the 2010s and fractured entirely in the 2020s. Keystone XL's cancellation in 2021, US export tariffs, and Buy American policies started to sow distrust. Under Trump's return to power in 2025, these policies hardened into a combative energy nationalism. His threats of 25% to 35% tariffs on foreign oil and gas were aimed at pressuring allies. But Canada wasn't just another ally. It was the linchpin in America's energy supply. Meanwhile, global dynamics were shifting. With Europe still entangled in the aftermath of Russia's war on Ukraine and Asia's demand for LNG surging, Canada saw an opportunity to break free from its historical overdependence on the US. It wasn't just about dollars and cents, it was about sovereignty. Then came a new generation of Canadian leadership. Mark Carney, once a global central banker, now turned strategist-in-chief, had a different vision. His aim wasn't just to ship gas, it was to realign Canada's entire economic and political trajectory. What had once been a quiet supplier was preparing to become a strategic player. And in June 2025, the world watched as a 70,000-ton LNG shipment departed Kitimat, British Columbia, bypassing US pipelines, heading straight to South Korea. The era of quiet cooperation was over. The age of direct confrontation had begun. By early 2025, Trump's second term was not just a sequel, it was a strategic escalation. Determined to reassert American supremacy in global energy markets, the administration ramped up its campaign to tighten control over critical imports. The logic was blunt. If the US could flood the market with cheap shale gas and oil, then it could dictate terms, not only to adversaries like China or Iran, but also to allies like Canada. In February, Trump's economic team floated a proposal to impose punitive tariffs of up to 35% on imported energy products, citing national security concerns and unfair trade advantages. Canadian oil and LNG were top of the list. The administration framed this as a way to bring back energy jobs, protect US refiners, and incentivize new infrastructure projects within the continental US. Behind closed doors, however, there were deeper calculations. Canada's rising autonomy in energy, fueled by projects like LNG Canada and Coastal GasLink, was quietly eroding a strategic US advantage, captive supply. Trump and his advisors knew that if Canada could bypass the US grid entirely, selling directly to Asia, it would undermine American leverage in both trade and diplomacy. The tariffs were also a political move. Trump used them to score populist points, pitching them to voters in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Texas as a defense of American energy workers. In stump speeches, he railed against what he called globalist backdoors, pipelines and tankers that carried wealth out of American ports while foreign countries profited. "Why should we let Canada piggyback off our market, then go flirt with Asia?" he thundered at a Houston rally. But there were complications. American refineries in the Midwest, including those in Detroit, Chicago, and Minneapolis, processed about 3.7 million barrels per day of Canadian crude, a heavy, sour blend ideal for their equipment. Replacing that would be costly and inefficient. Even Trump's own Energy Information Administration flagged the risks. If Canada redirected supply, the US would be forced to rely on longer-haul imports, driving up transportation costs and refinery delays. Still, the administration pressed forward. In May 2025, the White House officially included Canadian energy products in a new tariff readiness framework, signaling imminent escalation. At the same time, federal agencies pushed hard for the revival of stalled domestic projects, including the controversial Willow and Keystone systems, only to hit repeated legal roadblocks and environmental protests. What Trump failed to predict was just how fast Canada would move to counter. By the time the ink dried on the proposed tariffs, Mark Carney was already 2 steps ahead. Mark Carney's response wasn't reactionary, it was architectural. As early as March 2025, his government began rolling out a sweeping realignment of Canadian energy strategy. Central to this was the One Canadian Economy Act, Bill C-5, passed on June 26 with surprising speed and bipartisan support. The law collapsed overlapping regulations and created a fast-track mechanism to greenlight major infrastructure projects in record time. For Canada, this was more than red tape reform. It was liberation. Projects that once took 5 years to navigate approval pipelines could now move in under 2. At the heart of this new push was a bold reorientation. Instead of being tethered to the US market, Canada would now chart an independent path toward Asia, one LNG carrier at a time. The jewel in the crown? The LNG Canada terminal at Kitimat, British Columbia, a $40 billion joint venture involving Shell, Petronas, PetroChina, Mitsubishi, and Kogas. In late June, its first cargo of 70,000 tons departed directly to South Korea. No detours through the US, no customs bottlenecks, no tariffs. To make this leap possible, Canada relied heavily on its newly completed Coastal GasLink pipeline, 670 kilometers of steel artery linking the Montney Basin to Kitimat, and plans were already underway for a second wave, a massive crude oil pipeline from Alberta to Prince Rupert, with the potential to redirect up to 1 million barrels per day toward Pacific markets. But Carney knew energy policy couldn't just be technocratic, it had to be political. To sell the shift to the public, he framed it as a story of Canadian sovereignty. For too long, we've been a branch plant economy, he told Parliament. Now, we're building the trunk. The messaging resonated. Provinces like British Columbia and Alberta, long at odds over pipeline politics, found new common ground in the face of American pressure. Even corporate leaders, wary of Washington's unpredictability, rallied behind the shift. Exporters, facing punitive tariffs from the US, quickly reoriented deals toward Japan, Taiwan, and India. But the pivot wasn't without friction. Several First Nations communities expressed outrage at Bill C-5, warning that its fast-track provisions threatened their constitutional rights to consultation. Hereditary chiefs from Wet'suwet'en territories, still smarting from the Coastal GasLink saga, issued public statements accusing Ottawa of ramming through industrial colonialism in the name of trade. In response, Carney launched a national dialogue tour in July 2025, promising local forums and legal reviews. But critics weren't convinced. Lawsuits loomed, protests bubbled. The strategic gamble to leap past American bottlenecks had sparked a new kind of domestic reckoning. Still, from a geopolitical standpoint, Canada had changed the game. No longer a subordinate exporter, It had weaponized its geography and policy to become an autonomous force in global energy markets. And for the first time in modern history, Washington found itself outmaneuvered by its polite, persistent neighbor to the north. By August 2025, the US-Canada energy relationship had morphed from interdependence into standoff. Trump's threats hung in the air, but every new tariff risked collateral damage to American consumers and industries. Canadian oil no longer needed US ports. Canadian LNG no longer needed US approval, but Canada too faced uncomfortable questions. Bill C-5 may have streamlined policy, but it also intensified Indigenous resistance and environmental backlash. Carney's balancing act between economic pragmatism and social legitimacy grew shakier by the week. Worse yet, global markets had taken notice. Asian buyers, long wary of North American supply volatility, now saw Canada as a more reliable long-term partner. But the stability was an illusion built on fragile consent at home and a fraying alliance abroad. As both countries dug in, industry leaders on both sides of the border began to panic. US refiners scrambled to source compatible crude. Canadian firms feared legal delays. Investors hedged against the chaos, pulling back from new capital ventures. The diplomatic channels? Nearly frozen, with Trump preoccupied by domestic political battles and Carney's office overwhelmed by regional pushback, formal talks stalled. Each side waited for the other to blink first. But this wasn't poker. It was a collision course, one where both economies had something real to lose and no off-ramp in sight. Nestled along the misty coast of British Columbia, the small town of Kitimat is now the epicenter of a global energy pivot. Once a quiet smelting town with a declining population, Kitimat has been reborn as Canada's LNG capital. Hotels are fully booked year-round. Local diners are packed with engineers, roughnecks, and shipping agents. Unemployment is down, real estate is booming, but not everyone is celebrating. Just 30 kilometers inland, the Wet'suwet'en Nation watches the transformation with apprehension. Their ancestral lands lie along the coastal gas link route, land that now hums with compressor stations and helicopter flyovers. Though the project was approved after years of legal and political wrangling, many hereditary chiefs still argue they were never meaningfully consulted. They see Bill C-5 not as progress, but as the latest in a long history of sidelining Indigenous sovereignty. Fast track for who? Asked one community leader in a CBC interview. We're not speed bumps. The tensions are not just philosophical. In July 2025, blockades were erected along portions of logging roads north of Houston, BC. Protesters shut down construction on an auxiliary pipeline project, one that was part of the broader Prince Rupert crude export plan. The RCMP responded cautiously, but the risk of escalation loomed large. Meanwhile, Canadian environmental groups, previously mollified by Trudeau-era climate policies, are now sounding alarms. The Canada-Asia corridor may reduce American leverage, but it also accelerates fossil fuel production at home. Emissions targets, once seen as sacrosanct, now appear negotiable under the banner of energy independence. For Carney, the cost of autonomy is rising, not just financially, but socially. Lawsuits are stacking up in British Columbia and Alberta. International scrutiny is increasing. And while Asian buyers are pleased, the Canadian public is growing weary of being asked to choose between global power and local justice. Kitimat may be the new symbol of Canadian energy might, but just beyond its shimmering ports lies a landscape of fragile trust and unfinished reconciliation. In Detroit, Michigan, at the Marathon Petroleum Refinery on Oakwood Boulevard, a quiet crisis is unfolding. The facility, which processes over 120,000 barrels per day, was built to handle heavy crude, specifically the kind that flows down from Alberta. But since Canada redirected a portion of its exports toward Asia in June 2025, the plant's input costs have surged. Middle Eastern and Venezuelan blends are heavier but pricier and take longer to arrive. Refiners now face the dilemma of reconfiguring systems or paying premiums that eat into already tight margins. It's not just oil. On the Gulf Coast, several LNG terminals, including Sabine Pass and Corpus Christi, were banking on Canadian feedstock to supplement capacity. With Canada going it alone, those options are shrinking. Supply volatility is increasing, and Asian buyers are starting to negotiate harder, knowing the US isn't the only game in town anymore. Then there's the consumer angle. In July, gasoline prices in Chicago and Minneapolis rose by 27 cents per gallon, an increase partly blamed on constrained Canadian supply. Local news stations showed lines at Costco gas stations and truckers protesting rate hikes on interstates. For middle-class families, this isn't a geopolitical chess match, it's a weekly budget crisis. American agribusiness hasn't been spared either. Fertilizer companies reliant on Canadian natural gas derivatives are paying more to secure spot shipments. Some are cutting contracts, others raising prices on corn and soybean farmers just as harvest season looms. Ironically, the tariff threats that were meant to discipline Canada have instead boomeranged. By trying to corner the market, the US has backed itself into a cost spiral, one where policy arrogance clashes with physical reality. For Trump, the political optics are dangerous. His base, blue-collar workers, truckers, rural Americans, are the very people feeling the pinch. In trying to punish a neighbor, he may have inadvertently punished his own voters. From the icy ports of Kitimat to the refinery stacks of Detroit, the energy battle between Canada and the United States is no longer hypothetical. It's here, it's escalating, and it's redefining decades of economic alignment. On one side, Canada pushes forward, faster, bolder, more global. On the other, the US retaliates, louder, angrier, increasingly isolated. Both nations claim to be acting in self-interest. Both believe they're securing the future. But in doing so, they're pulling at the very threads that once tied their fortunes together. Pipelines are being redrawn, but so are political alliances, economic assumptions, and social contracts. This isn't just about oil or gas. It's about who leads and who follows in a world of shifting power. In the race to shape the future, will North America win together or fail apart trying to go it alone? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and your view in the comments below.